Hi. Let me say first off, thank you to everyone who's been watching these videos that we've been posting on this channel. I do appreciate it, and the more you watch, the more you comment, the more you like and subscribe, I guess the more the algorithm pushes these videos out to a larger potential viewing audience, so I do appreciate the support. Now also, I do read every comment that anyone makes on these videos. The really crass, coarse criticisms, those kind of comments usually don't see the light of day because I realize that the audience for these videos is primarily Christian people who just don't need to be exposed to that kind of foul language. And so those videos hit the dustbin pretty quickly. But if it's just a genuine criticism, I usually leave that up. Of course, some of those fall into the category of just being silly criticisms. I think recently I was criticized as being part of the frozen chosen who have no joy. And anybody who knows me knows that that's not true. I speak fluently the language of sarcasm and humor. So those kinds of silly comments, I usually leave them just so that the viewing audience who wants to read those comments can see how the other side thinks and how they respond. And then there are genuine, good comments, complimentary comments, encouraging comments, keep going. Well, I really appreciate those. And then there are questions. And sometimes those questions are really good questions that deserve to be answered. And that's really why this video and the next one, or I might just combine them, are going to be replies to current questions. The first one I'm going to look at here today is from a viewer who said, "But Calvinism is a secondary issue, right?" Calvinism, let's talk about that for a moment. Calvinism is a nickname for what it is that I teach and believe. I don't teach it or believe it because John Calvin said it, but these are the doctrines that grew out of the Protestant Reformation. They sometimes go by the nickname sovereign grace theology, which is a name I like very much because that encapsulates the whole of the theology that I promote, which is that God is in fact sovereign over his creation, and that salvation is a result of grace. And so sovereign grace suits me very well. But that same theology does also carry the moniker Calvinism, and I am aware of that. However, at GCA, Grace Christian Assembly, where I've been the pastor for almost 25 years now, I have never in all those years taught Calvin. I haven't taught through the institutes. I don't spend a lot of time in creeds. Instead, what I concentrate on is the Bible. What does the Bible say? Because there does seem to be a real dearth of biblical teaching in the vast majority of Christian conversations and churches these days. And so I decided years ago that that was what we were going to concentrate on. However, the Bible does say things that fit very neatly into the outline that is given to us through Calvinism, particularly the 5 points, the tulip doctrines. Now, it's important to realize that those doctrines, those 5 points, are actually a response to the Arminian contingency that came to the Synod of Dort in order to argue their position. The Synod of Dort occurred long after John Calvin and Jacob Arminius were dead. So it wasn't that John Calvin was making up these things and endorsing them at the Synod. The simple fact is that his students, they came to defend the teaching that said that God was sovereign in salvation, as against those of the Arminian camp who argued that human will played some significant part. That's a real encapsulation of what went on at the Synod of Dort. You should sit and read someday what the Synod of Dort was, what the arguments were. But it began with the Remonstrants, the Arminian students laying out their argument, which happened to fall into 5 categories. So the 5 points, the tulip doctrine, that is usually considered synonymous with sovereign grace Calvinistic teaching, those 5 points are responses to the Arminian arguments. Okay, so that's Calvinism in a nutshell and my approach to Calvinism. Now, is Calvinism a secondary issue? It is inasmuch as I don't agree with everything that Calvin ever said or Calvin ever taught. I don't believe in sacralism. I don't believe in using the power of the state to drive people to the church. Calvin and I had large disagreements about how communion is done and how frequently, and the real presence of Christ in the elements of communion. We disagree about baptism. We disagree about a lot of stuff, which is why I don't teach John Calvin per se. But I do agree with the doctrines, with the teaching that carry his nickname. So if you're saying, are the things that John Calvin himself taught, are those secondary issues, then I can say yes, because the Bible is the primary issue. Now, I also have to say that in the Bible, Paul talks a lot about sound doctrine, whole, healthy, meaningful doctrine. That word doctrine just means teaching. It's a word that we still use to this day when talking about even politics, and you'll talk about a particular president's doctrine on a particular subject. So doctrine just means teaching, so Paul emphasized the necessity of proper teaching, whole, healthy, correct teaching. In fact, he went so far as to say that if anyone were to preach anything other than what he preached, the doctrine, the teaching that he presented, if anyone said anything else, they were teaching another gospel and were therefore to be anathema. So it sounds to me like Paul considered sound doctrine and proper teaching to be right up there, first level issue, necessarily important, not something that you can consider secondary. So to the degree that Calvinism aligns with what the Bible says, then it is, in fact, a first-tier issue. And when it comes to systematics, and particularly when it comes to the question of how people get saved, the biblical doctrine of salvation, well, then you do find the sovereignty of God emphasized the same way that you see the sovereignty of God emphasized in Calvinism. So to that degree, Calvinism does become a top-level, first-tier issue. So I guess it all comes down to how we define our language. I would say that no man's individual teaching, including my own, is first tier. That is all secondary issues. The Bible is first tier. That's top drawer stuff. That's the important stuff. And to the degree that any man's teaching aligns with the Bible, aligns with Pauline, whole, healthy teaching, well, that's when that teaching becomes important, vital. And so the answer to the question, so Calvinism is a secondary issue, right? The answer is, well, yes and no. It depends by what you mean, or it depends what you mean by Calvinism. So I hope that cleared it up just a little bit. Sovereign grace theology is of vital importance so that we can understand the biblical teaching of how people get saved, because that debate is still ongoing, as you can see in the comment section. And whether God is truly, genuinely sovereign in salvation is something that people still wrestle with. And so that does make it really important because we're talking about the character of God and how God does things. But if you're talking about a system of theology that, like Calvin wrote in his Institutes, well then, yes, that's just supporting information in the history of Christian development and thinking, and does not rise to the importance that the Bible rises to. So, all right there. I hope it was helpful. Question 1 down. Next video, question 2, which is really interesting. See you soon.